So the project Underwriting Beirut started in 2013 with the idea of digging, borrowing from the archaeological term, digging into the specific locations of Beirut, into the multi-layered history. And the title, Underwriting, means the writing that is under the writing. So it is inspired by the notion of palimpsest. Yet I decided to use another term, although in Arabic the translation Tatris Beirut means palimpsest, or is the closest to its translation. The idea was that not just that Beirut had so many layers of history, but that if you look from the present time at any specific places in the city, and if you dig into its history, what are the various forms that will emerge? What are the various poetic forms? What are the various narratives that will emerge? And some are concealed and will never see the day, and other I will be able to maybe reveal through the research. So these were research-based projects. I decided for the first chapter to start with the neighborhood where I lived. I decided to focus on the National Museum. Why? Because the National Museum was really at the location of what used to be the dividing line between East and West during the war, which was the site of a lot of kidnapping, killings, and which saw also many people trying to cross from both sides. And for me, it was a crucial place in the city. And when I started to look in the history of that museum, one thing that was striking was that there was almost, I couldn't have access to an index of its collection. It was very complicated. Some places, some things were probably stolen, others were maybe destroyed. It is said that there was a bomb that destroyed and burned some of the objects. It is also said that the previous director and his team have succeeded in preventing objects from being looted by building a wall and concealing the object in a hidden room, as well as protecting the sarcophagus with concrete. And so all the objects that could possibly be protected were covered with concrete. One object that could not be protected, and that was not yet made public when I started my project, was the mosaic of the Good Shepherd. And that mosaic of the Good Shepherd was a beautiful Roman Byzantine mosaic that was vertically on a wall. And the current director then, and still director of this Museum of Archaeology, Anne-Marie Feisch, when I asked her to look at the objects that were maybe potentially destroyed or in storage, could not show them to me because I was not an archaeologist or I didn't have any specific request. So the only object she could show me was this mosaic of the Good Shepherd before it became visible for the public. And there was a hole made by a sniper during the war that had established his setup, a whole setup in order to shoot from within the museum or access and be able to see through the museum hall the outside. And so he was able to point his weapon and at people outside and observe and probably kill. And so I produced a series of elements related to the history of the museum and the war. So it's one installation called Underwriting Beirut Madhaf, which encompasses several objects, the most important of which is the traces of the void that was made by the sniper. So it is the imprint, it is the negative of the whole that is transformed into a sculpture. I called it Object of War. it resonates with a previous project I had done on the Lebanese civil war called Objects of War, which was very different, which had to do more with the subjective stories of the war. But this one for me was almost like a relic of that war, and the object could be at the same time an artifact, something that looked like an archaeological find, but also a testimony of this tragedy. How it worked is I measured myself with a meter, the hole, and I made sketches. So I measured its width, its length. I couldn't measure the depth, but I asked architects and people who had worked on the history of the 50s, and at the end I decided for the standard size of a wall. And then I produced with a 3D designer a 3D design of that void. I created a mold, and from that mold we poured concrete in it. And the use of concrete was of course reminiscent of the use of concrete to protect the artifacts of the museum. It's also what is used for construction, for architecture, because it looked like it's an abstract shape. It could look like a trunk of a tree, but it's absolutely not. So I have these 3 photographs that always accompany the sculpture. And along with it was a book, Object Missing from the National Museum, that is a leather book that evokes the objects that potentially were looted or disappeared from the museum. And then you had another print photographs, 3 meter by 150, which include all the objects that I was able to photograph that were visible versus those who were not visible that I couldn't access. So I went one day in December 2012 and I photographed every label and objects that were visible that day. And I made a photograph of the list of all these objects in a way to show the entire museum in one picture, like a scan of this museum and of its history and even of its politics, in a way to reveal the historiography of the museum. Along with these objects, you also had a video which attempt to imagine the point of view of the sniper. It's called 180-degree garden view. And it tries from the very point of view of the hole of the sniper to imagine what he could have seen and the angle of vision. So it's actually a view of the garden, of the current garden of the museum. And finally, I made from my window, looking at the museum, and I decided to use a technique that maybe children can learn when they're 10, which is a pinhole camera. So you do a pin in a shoebox and you put a photosensitive paper. I wanted to imprint the landscape and the view of the museum in our contemporary time, but in a ghostly manner, the image of that landscape every day for months. The result, which is something that is like an image that almost looked like a haunted image, or sort of merge the history of this museum and with our present time. Chapter 2 of Underwriting Beirut is about the river of Beirut. After the neighborhood where I lived, Madhaf, I decided to deal with the neighborhood where I worked, so around Beirut Art Center, co-founded with Sandra Dare in 2009. For me, what was very interesting is when we first moved into Beirut Art Center, the area was completely left abandoned. Many factories were abandoned. There were a few factories that were still working, but I started to be interested in how this neighborhood, it's not really a neighborhood, how this area, which was an industrial area, developed. And what happened during the war during that time, but also what was happening currently, and the transformation, even gentrification that was happening. So I made a series. I first had filmed in 2010, a film inside the river called The River, which I produced in 2013. It's a film which is a single shot inside the river, and it speaks of the suspended space and the notion of exile and displacement. For me, the river was a space that was suspended in time, because it was not used as a river anymore, but it no longer became something else. Like, it could happen, there were many projects of doing public gardens or transformation of the area, etc. And so the second aspect of the river were a series of drawings based on the maps of the river. And then the third was an installation called After the River in 2016, where I interviewed a businessman and the janitor of Beirut Art Center, who was a Syrian refugee in Lebanon. For me, it was an attempt to explore the sensorial geography of this area, but also its social history, and through a 3-channel video. And the third chapter of Underwriting Beirut looked and researched an area that is in the southern suburb of Beirut called Joreige. And until the 60s was an area that was very little inhabited. It was sand dunes, and its land were contested between public land, mashea, and private land. And in 1955 there was the trial of the sand, which decided that some of its land were private and did not belong to the Beirut municipality as the inhabitant claimed it. The result of it was that many families moved illegally there and established themselves. There were only a few families, among which the family of a friend of mine, his grandfather. How I came to this area is because of my film, And the Living is Easy. In that film, I filmed several characters. One of them was Firas Baidoun, and I filmed him in Joreige. But I was struck how Joreige sort of encompassed all the issues and problems of Lebanon, from sectarianism to issues of displacement during the war, to issues of urbanization, legal matters that were related to the various plots and how the land is divided and who owns it, etc. So much of the history of Lebanon is related to that. And it also encompassed all the political problems. So the radical transformation of that region from a sand dune to an overpopulated place, to a place that was really marked by various waves of displacement. I was very interested in this transformation, so I wanted to see the aerial missions that the army did between the mid-50s until the mid-90s. They did several missions to map Lebanon. And I used these black and white, very small photographs to sort of reconstitute cartographies of this area. But I wanted to show in a poetic way this evolution. I didn't want to do like a corporate presentation of how it has transformed. So I wanted to play with colors, with our imagination, and I started to look at Google Earth and what can we see today? Can we see the sewage? We can see what happened to the illegal harbor that was then and that is no longer present. What happened to the massive construction, etc. So I started to merge different arrangement of these different photographic missions with the contemporary Google Earth imagery. I worked with a graphic designer, Scope Atelier, Tanya Arwashan, for months and months to create different images that reflect on that transformation, and these are called cartography of a transformation. There are 5 because I used in each of them a different aerial mission merged with a contemporary time. So the overlaying, the transparencies, how much sand do I allow to be visible, how much construction. It's accurate and it's not accurate, so it's somewhere between the accuracy of the photographic document and the actual aerial mission photograph, along with my own interpretation, my use of color, so they are actually subjective. Along with these cartographies of a transformation, I made a series of drawings called Coastline. And Coastline continues a work that I had started with the river, with the use of a map as a basis and a document for a drawing that will take its own path, I would say. So how it worked is I used several maps of Uzai's coastline, and I drew the basis of the coastline with a pencil, and then from that I used pigments and wax. It's my own cooking technique where I iron, wax, sprinkling pigments, creating shapes that are reminiscent of flowers, but also reminiscent when we talk of Uzai, we talk about also communities, we talk about clusters of constructions, and that developed in informal, uncontrolled, unplanned way, except for the main axis of Uzai, which was a road that was a strategic road linking this area to South Lebanon and to Beirut. The rest was built absolutely in a non-planned way. In my drawings, there's, because of the repetition of it and my practice for the past 25 years or 30 years, there's an experience of dealing and controlling the material I work with, but there's also a lot of accidents. So when you iron the wax with pigment, it also produces shapes and forms that you kind of control, but not to the millimeter. So there is also room for these shapes to take over. That also echoes this idea of informality, and so the shape become abstract. You can see them as, you see that there is a basis, a document as a basis, but you can also see them as abstract drawings. A third element, which was part of Uzai, which was crucial to me, was a sculpture made of metal alloy. First, I did a design based on research of these various streets and shapes that were created by the informal construction and the gradual transformation of the area. So in the sculpture you can see the main arcs and you see the small streets. When you look at the sculpture, you can imagine something else. Some people see a weapon, other people see an abstract shape, but in fact it's the actual map of a section of Uzai based on the 2017 Google Earth, but also based on friends and memories of people telling me about, I think there's this street or this street, because you couldn't see all of it through Google Earth in the detail that I wanted. Finally, after having filmed a lot in Uzai and after having done research, I decided not to do a film yet, but I wanted to use a lot of what I had gathered in terms of information, but in terms of the history, the personal history and the subjective point of view of that I had collected. And I did an installation made of 15 drawings recounting my personal history, my history, based on these collected memories of Joreige. So the drawings are based on photograph. It's called A Brief History of Joreige. So Underwriting Beirut is an ongoing project. Like a lot of my projects, they have a beginning but no end. I meant to have the fourth chapter on the harbor because I was always very interested in the history of the harbor as visible in my installation Beirut Autopsy of a City, where a lot of it revolved around the harbor, because the expansion of the harbor is what made Beirut, is what transformed Beirut and expanded the city and its number of inhabitants as of the mid-19th century. And so the history of the city is absolutely connected to the transformation of and the expansion of the harbor. And also because my gallery is called Marfa and is within the harbor. After what happened with the explosion, such a dramatic and unprecedented and catastrophic event, it demands to rethink this project. So it's still somewhere lingering in my mind, and maybe I will continue it in the next years, maybe not, we will see.